Hello, everyone, and welcome to this event of Humboldt Day. I'm David Nogues Bravo. I'm the Vice President of the International Biogeographic Society, and it's a great honor for the Society to have today this event from Colombia. So I would like to thank the organizers and all the attendees today and the speakers to contribute to Humboldt Day. The event that we have today has been organized by the Semillero de Investigación en Primatología y Conservación de sus Ecosistemas de la Universidad de Caldas en Colombia. So without further delay, muchas gracias por organizar el evento y os paso la palabra.
Muchas gracias, David. So, hello everyone. I'm Nicolás Botero, member of the Semillero de Investigación en Primatología SIPSI Research Group from the University of Caldas and Secretary of the Colombian Society of Primatologists. And it gets me very great pleasure to welcome you all to this new event from the International Humboldt Day launched by the International Biogeography Society and co-hosted by SIPSI. So SIPSI Research Group from the University of Caldas has worked in collaboration with the IBS to hold a meeting that meets two main objectives. The first one is commemorate Humboldt's legacy, and the second one is aimed at strengthening the bonds that give cohesion to biogeography as a science. So for this, today we have two prolific scientists who will help us to understand the fascinating link between the history of science and the diversity of primates. Professor and Dr. Jessica Lynch Alfaro from the University of California, Los Angeles, and Professor Dr. Alberto Gómez Gutiérrez from the Pontificia Universidad Javeriana in Colombia. So to begin with, Professor Gómez will comment on the main milestones of the Humboldt and Bonpland expeditions through America. Subsequently, Professor Lynch will present data, conclusions, and experiences on the biogeography of cervix. After each talk, a short session will be open for questions from the audience. So if any of you have a question, just type it on the chat window or Q&A button, which is at the bottom of your screens. So welcome again to Alexander von Humboldt, the link between primates, biogeography, and the advancements of science in Colombia. Okay, so today for our first talk, we are pleased to welcome Professor Dr. Alberto Gómez Gutiérrez. He is a renowned Colombian biologist and writer. He was given his bachelor degree in biology and microbiology from the Universidad de los Andes in Bogotá, and his PhD in biochemistry and immunology from the University of Paris in France. Currently, he is associate professor and researcher at the Medical Genetics Institute that belongs to the School of Medicine of the Universidad Javeriana in Bogotá. His research has focused on human genetical polymorphisms and plant-animal systematics. He has copious works in several topics in biology and the history of science in Colombia. He's an active member of the Colombian Society of History of the Medicine and fellow of the Linnean Society of London, among other prominent scientific societies. Additionally, he led the construction of one of the most important works regarding Alexander von Humboldt's life and scientific contributions, Humboldtiana Neogranadina. So with that, I ask you to give you full attention to Dr. Gómez and help me in welcome him to the camera. So Professor Gómez, can you share your screen, please?
Thank you, Nicolas, for your presentation. The first slide now. Thank you so much for your presentation and for your invitation to celebrate Humboldt International Day 2020 with the IBS. I will divide my talk in 6 sections. First, an introduction. Let me see whether this is working or not. Are you seeing the slides going by?
No, at the moment it's just showing your entry slide.
The introductory slide.
Now, do you have
yes.
the index? Okay. So I'll divide it, my talk in 6 sections. Introduction, Magdalena River, Humboldt's barometric leveling from Cartagena to Santafé, on plants and altitudes, iconographic epiphanies, and conclusion. And I will start with an epigraph written by Alexander von Humboldt when he was 85 years old. He said there are only three important and most peculiar works of mine: the geography of plants and the physical tableau of the tropics connected with it, the theory of isothermal lines, and the observations on the Earth's magnetism. That was in 1854. As stated in this epigraph, Humboldt himself referred to biogeography as one of the three most important findings of his whole life. However, according to a ranking published in 2004, he only reached the 5th place in a series of classic papers on the foundation of biogeography. I will refer today to Alexander von Humboldt's biogeographical achievements between 1801 and 1803, and also to the contemporary achievements of one of his illustrated contacts in nowadays Colombia, Francisco José de Caldas. The American expedition of Alexander von Humboldt and Aimé Bonpland went through sea, land, and rivers. And although these have been represented with two-dimensional maps, such as the one found in Wikipedia, one of the most transcendent aspects of their journey was its three-dimensional character. Before drawing his tableau physique, or Naturgemälde of the Andes, centered on the Chimborazo, the Prussian had to collect species and physical measurements step by step, up and down the Andes, through the territory that corresponds to the Viceroyalty of New Granada, in a journey that began at sea level in Cartagena and culminated near the summit of Chimborazo, then considered the highest mountain in the world. You may follow his steps up and down in a web page that we have prepared in order to include a number of extracts of a 5-volume work printed in 2018, Humboldtiana Neogranadina. This collection will also be published online with open access next month for all of you to study and appreciate eventually. Humboldt's Neo-Granadian journey prompted him to produce in 1801 at least 2 preliminary manuscripts that reveal the foundation of his research. First, a sketch of the course of the Rio Grande de la Magdalena, and second, the barometric leveling from Cartagena to Santafé. Both manuscripts show well the Humboldtian geographic interests before the biogeographic concretion of the Chimborazo that he would draw 2 years later in Guayaquil in the first months of 1803, and which he would upgrade and engrave in order to illustrate his first essay on the geography of plants, both in French and in German, in 1807. Magdalena River. Humboldt's first cartographic approaches in America included many river maps. In these, the third geographic dimension of mountains was only recorded with the flattened outlines that are characteristic of the Prussian, such as those that can be seen in the sketch that he elaborated while traveling in the Orinoco River in 1800. This same task was undertaken in the Magdalena River in his journey from Cartagena to Santafé in the months of April, May, and June 1801. The first sketch of the course of the Rio Grande de la Magdalena that you can see in your screens, as Humboldt registered in his manuscripts, contains in 4 independent pages the sketches that he drew free-handedly with curves, beaches, islands, villages, and tributaries of this river, specifying in marginal text distances and other data. Barometric leveling from Cartagena to Santafé. Although Humboldt had already produced some sketches with barometric levelings in continental Spain, the Canary Islands, Venezuela, and Cuba, his first formal publication of a geographical profile appeared in September 1802 in the Allgemeine Geographische Ephemeriden under the title barometric leveling of the main points between Cartagena and Santafé in South America. This first publication was produced in Weimar based on a manuscript that remains unpublished and unidentified. Today, I would like to show you a primary source entitled Barometric Leveling between Cartagena and Santafé that can be identified as an original teamwork of Humboldt and anonymous collaborators in Bogotá in 1801, and which is now preserved at the Army Archives in Madrid, Spain. Based on this manuscript and on 4 successive representations of this same geographical profile, I will postulate that the botanical dimension of the iconic and world-known Humboldtian representation of the Naturgemäld, centered on the Chimborazo, arose in his Neo-Grenadian journey through nowadays Colombian territories and was potentiated by his personal meeting with Francisco José Caldas, a local naturalist who had been working on the idea of phytogeography in these same territories since 1796. At least 3 barometric levelings followed the original Humboldt drawing, and I show them here in chronological order. First in New Granada in 1801, and then in Europe in 1802. Complementary information on geographical locations and landmarks was registered on the profiles, and also in tables and supplementary texts. All these resulted in the engraved and printed profile that was published 30 years later, in 1831, as the Profil du chemin de Cartagena des Andes au plateau de Santafé, Bogotá, in Humboldt's Atlas géographique et physique des régions équinoxiales du nouveau continent. If one compares the registered locations on each profile, it's easy to reveal the orthographic mutations originated in the process of its transcription and translation of the information included in each anonymous manuscript before the engraved edition of 1831, as it usually happens at the molecular level in genetic processes in nature. On plants and altitudes. There is evidence that both Alexander von Humboldt and Francisco José de Caldas had already conceived in the last decade of the 18th century, more than 5 years before their first personal meeting in today's frontier between Colombia and Ecuador, the need to register phytogeographic dimension in their cartography. And they both began their work by measuring altitude for the plants they found on the journeys. While Humboldt did it with a seemingly non-specific interest, Caldas focused on plants that he considered useful to human societies. In his 20-page memory on the leveling of plants cultivated in the vicinity of Equator, dated April 6, 1803, where he included a phytogeographic profile, he explicitly defined the origin of his initiative. Quote, "In all the small trips that I have been able to verify within the Viceroyalty of Santa Fe, my first care has been to observe the elevation, the quality, and the limits to which the culture of useful plants is reduced, and on which our subsistence depends. Since 1796, when I began to see these things with reflection until today, I have collected a considerable number of observations and facts. I have compared them, I have ordered this material, and I think I can already draw some general conclusions." End of quote. But in April 21, 1802, 1 year before this memory was written, Caldas had stated in his memory on the plan of a journey from Quito to North America, sent to José Celestino Mutis, the director of the Royal Expedition in New Granada, a clear pioneering description of phytogeography, with the particular warning that nothing had been made known to Mr. Barham of these materials. I quote, "I have always been annoyed by a map in which only the names of miserable locations are included. It's better to see in it the place, the homeland of a plant, of a mineral, of a species of animal, of a hot spring, etc., than the pile of barbarous names that we can hardly pronounce. How beautiful, how interesting it would be to put at the head of the flora of Bogotá a botanical chart of the kingdom, as I want to call it, a chart in which, by suppressing so many dark villages, so many streams of no consideration, we place instead the plants, useful to the arts, to trade, to health. How curious, how worthy of notice would it be to notice the elevations in which plants are raised in the superb flora of Bogotá, and say it lives in Quito, and it's added in a precise way at so many toeses, meaning an equivalent of meters, of elevation over the sea. The barometer stands at snow limit at 16 inches, at sea at 28 or near. The difference is 12 inches. Wouldn't it be new and at the same time beautiful to divide into 12 zones of 1 inch in the barometer the whole part of the earth that is capable of vegetating? Wouldn't it be new to assign each plant its limits and in a laconic and exact way to say it lives in the first zone, it lives from the third to the fifth, and so on? I have designed barometric botanical leveling systems similar to those that Baron de Humboldt has built for the sole purpose of giving an idea of the different heights of the land. I divide them into 12 zones which will not be equal in width, because the higher zones would gradually increase in elevation, and I place in each one the plants that vegetate in it. If one grows in 2, 3, or more, it's placed in the lower one and in the last one, and this announces that it thrives in the intermediates. This idea touches me. I think it's new and worth trying. End of quote. This is what Caldas told Mutis in April 1802, 1 year before Humboldt's drawing of Chimborazo with his own geography of plants. And these two successive evidences in the years 1802 and 1803 show well the original character of the development of phytogeography in New Granada and in the mind and writings of Francisco José de Caldas. It is particularly significant that Caldas, as we have seen, considered the barometric botanical leveling as a new and worthwhile idea in April 21, 1802, 3.5 months after living day by day with Humboldt and Bonpland in Quito and its surroundings. Caldas thus advanced somewhat independently until the first half of 1802 in the botanical and geographical components of his cartography with numerical tabulations and isolated reflections on the geography of plants. 1 year before, the graphical representations of a specific association of altitude and plants in iconographic elaborations according to, I quote, barometric botanical leveling similar to those that Mr. Baron de Humboldt had built for the sole purpose of giving an idea of the different heights of the land, end of quote. As for Humboldt's background, in the field of plant geography between 1790 and 1801, at least the following evidences can be cited. First, according to his own record, the Prussian had already reported in 1790 the first sketch for a geography of plants to Georg Forster, his traveling companion in England in those years. 3 years later, in his work entitled Flora Freibergensis Specimen, Humboldt referred to these concepts in the following terms. I quote, the observation of individual parts of trees or grasses should in no way be considered as plant geography. Rather, plant geography traces the connections and relationships by which all plants are connected to each other, designates what soils they are in, what atmospheric conditions they inhabit, and describes the surface of the land on which the humus is prepared, end of quote. A few lines earlier, in the same footnote of the original Latin text of this book, when defining geognosy, he proposed it as the science that studies animate and inanimate nature, organic and inorganic bodies. And it's divided into three domains: the geography of solid rocks, which Abraham Werner, has industrially studied; zoological geography, the foundations of which have been laid by Zimmermann; and the geography of plants, which our colleagues have left intact. In addition to this, some sporadic mentions of the geography of plants in Humboldt's pre-American correspondence focused on plant relationships and their aesthetic dimension, with no specific reference to their direct correlation with altitude or latitude. A good example appears in a letter written in 1794 to Friedrich Schiller. I quote, "To date, the history of nature has been studied in such a way that only differences in form are retained in the study of the physiognomy of plants. But you understand, as I do, that something higher must be perceived, that there is something to be rediscovered. We must follow Aristotle and Pliny, who included in their description of nature both the aesthetic sense and the artistic education of man. These ancient thinkers certainly had a broader view of nature than our wretched registrators." End of quote. This is what Humboldt would develop as a physiognomy. Okay, so I take from Schiller's note, Humboldt to Schiller's?
I think so.
Yes, Professor.
Okay, then Humboldt wrote to Schiller on what he called and developed as a physiognomy of plants, not geography of plants. Once he started his journey to the new continent, the concept of a geography of plants, as it is known today, took time to reappear. In fact, there are no known explicit references to plant geography in his American correspondence. Prior to the mention of this term in a letter to Jean-Baptiste Delambre, a French astronomer and mathematician, member of the Academy of Sciences, and director of the Astronomical Observatory in Paris. In this letter, signed in Lima in November 25, 1802, can you see the next slide here? Yeah, here.
Not yet. Oh, yeah. I think there's just a small pause between most of your slides, so you might want to give a little.
Okay. Can you see the map?
Yes, now we can.
Okay. In this letter, signed in Lima on November 25, 1802, Humboldt announced to this astronomer, not a botanist, his explicit intention to do a work on the geography of plants. I quote, "Today we have 3,784 very complete descriptions in Latin and about 1/3 of plants in the herbaria that due to lack of time, we have not been able to describe. There is no plant of which we cannot indicate the rock on which it lives and the height in toes to which it rises, so that the geography of plants will find in our manuscripts very exact materials." This was in November, November 25, 1802. Few months later, in February 1803, Humboldt would specify this project in his first draft manuscript, which was published, as you can see here, 6 years later in Bogotá, sent from the port of Guayaquil to José Celestino Mutis before traveling north by sea to the Viceroyalty of New Spain, nowadays Mexico. By order of Humboldt, this manuscript had to pass through the hands of Juan Pío de Montúfar, the Marquis of Selva Alegre, and Francisco José de Caldas, both living in Quito at that time. I quote, this is Humboldt. I drew this painting for the first time in the port of Guayaquil in February 1803, when I was returning from Lima by the South Sea, and when I was preparing to sail to Acapulco. I sent a copy of this first sketch to Mr. Mutis in Santafé, Bogotá, who honored me with a particular kindness, end of quote. And Caldas specified in a letter to Mutis the custody chain that Humboldt had determined for this first sketch on the geography of plants. Said Caldas, quote, Baron Humboldt, who left Guayaquil 2 months ago, sent a tin cannon to the Marquis de Selvalegre, which contained a memoir on the geography of plants. I do not know why he kept it in his possession for a long time and did not give it to me to be sent by my hand, according to the will of the Baron himself, end of quote. Humboldt endorsed this fact in his diary when he registered in February 20, 1803, his remission of letters to Caldas as follows, quote, the pilot left us after Mass. I gave him letters for Caldas, with a description of the genus Dichondra, of which he believed he had discovered new species in the town of Ibarra. According to what Caldas himself has said, this reference would have been a manuscript of the geography of plants, which he had asked him to forward to Mutis, as well as the specific response to the request of Caldas in his letter from Otavalo, signed on November 17, 1802. You can see an image of one of the pages, the last page of this letter, from Caldas to Humboldt. I quote, I do not know how it escaped to me taking the characters of the genus Dichondra from these authors, as my Palau, a botanical reference of the time, does not have them. Please, your lordship, copy it and send it to me. I believe that in that city, Lima, there will be good books on botany. If a Schreber was found, end of quote. Unfortunately, the original manuscript, now kept in Berlin, is truncated at that point, as you can see in the image. And it's not possible to know today what else did Caldas would have told Humboldt on these and other matters in his letter. Nor is it possible to know what did Humboldt said to Caldas in a previous letter that he had sent him from town of Trujillo in Peru, as reported by Caldas, I quote, full of expressions of affections and news of his journey, end of quote. In the first pages of his reply from Otavalo, Caldas registered his own barometric and botanical endeavors in direct correlation. I quote, I climbed the northern slopes of Cotacache up to the snow, from where it's absolutely inaccessible. I checked my observation of the barometer and boiling water, and I found a considerable number of plants. End of quote. It is then worth asking, was the report of Caldas on November 17, 1802, a stimulus for Humboldt in the configuration and or the subsequent mailing from Guayaquil, which is very rare, through the hands of Caldas, of the biogeographical profile of Chimborazo that the Prussian dedicated to Mutis in February 1803? It's not easy to properly substantiate in an exhaustive and definitive manner the progressive development of the phytogeographic concept in the mind of the Prussian in the course of his trans-Neo-Grenadian journey, before his remission of this original manuscript in February 1803. However, based on a first approach to Humboldt's manuscripts associated with his American travelogue, at least one paragraph can be quoted which clearly and explicitly reveals that this traveler, Humboldt, was taking pioneering notes associated with the geography of plants already in New Granada. I quote, on the 12th of September, we started a journey to Ibagué, as we were immediately more attentive to the geography of plants than to the altitude of the site. I repeat, as we were immediately more attentive to the geography of plants than to the altitude of the site, meaning physiognomy of plants, we notice with interest how each day the vegetation of Llano de Bogotá left us and new ones came to meet the hot ground. With the exception of Quito and Peru, there is no country like the Kingdom of New Granada, where thermometer in hand, not having to travel more than 10 miles, said Humboldt, you can choose any appropriate climate. You descend on a terrace where the vegetation on the hot sides is mixed densely to the limiting of the cold zone. End of quote. Humboldt had left Bogotá on September 8, 1801, after living with Mutis for 2 months in the city. And after having noticed that, as he recorded 4 years later in the introduction of his essay sur la géographie des plantes in 1807, that, I quote, no one was in better position than him, Mutis, to judge the accuracy of my observations and to expand on them with those who had personally made in the course of 40 years of travels in New Granada. Mr. Mutis, whose barometric measurements made it possible to judge the height of each station, would have been able, better than any botanist, to gather interesting observations on the geography of plants, meaning that he didn't, Mutis. With this conviction, that's the end of quote. With this conviction and descending on foot from 2,600 meters of altitude in Bogotá towards the Magdalena River, Humboldt continued to take notes as he approached his meeting with Francisco José Caldas, who would stimulate him in this same field with both his questions and his silences. Iconographic epiphany. To open this section, it's important to consider that Humboldt had trained in the academic discipline of geology in Prussia, where he had learned to draw and represent the geologic layers associated with mining. This preliminary interest added to the need to complement the river mapping of his American journey with the orography of the territories he was traveling through was probably the origin of what he called nivellement in French, such as the one already shown as sketched in his diaries in Venezuela in 1800. His levelings consisted of a 2-dimensional Cartesian graphic elaboration with relatively precise and also arbitrary arrangements, which connected the heights measured at successive points along his route, complementing them with possible references from third parties, with the use of curved lines for peaks and slopes in a north-south or east-west direction, including extreme and interspersed plains. Both Humboldt and Caldas would have begun in 1802 a transition from a simple handwritten data tables and geographical levelings to what Humboldt would call a tableau physique at Chimborazo and Caldas nivelación, leveling, probably inspired by the previous Humboldtian nivellement or levelings of his route from Cartagena to Santafé, and they both progressively included botanical components in their graphic icons. It should be noted here that while Humboldt traveled with Caldas to the mouth of the Pichincha volcano in the outskirts of Quito in the first semester of 1802, he was still drawing geographical, not biogeographical profiles, as can be seen in the present representation of the Rucu Pichincha that you can see in your screens. A discussion on the European harbingers of the first Humboldtian tableau physique is beyond the intention of this talk. I will only cite the influence of Johann Wolfgang von Goethe in his perception and representation of nature in the Naturphilosophie movement. This influence of Goethe on Humboldt can be supported by the words written by Humboldt himself to Caroline von Volkshogen, Friedrich Schiller's sister-in-law, in a letter signed in Berlin on May 14, 1806. I quote, In the forests of the Amazon, as in the peaks of the Andes, I had the feeling that life itself infiltrated rocks, plants and animals, as much as the expansive breasts of humanity, as it was animated from pole to pole by a single spirit. As if it was animated from pole to pole by a single spirit. Everywhere I deeply felt how powerfully these relationships forged in Jena, where they met with Schiller and his brother Wilhelm, were now influencing me, Alexander von Humboldt. And thanks to Goethe's perspective in nature, said Humboldt, I acquired virtually new organs of perception. End of quote. As for Caldas, at least the title of Nivelación, leveling, would have been inspired by the title of Humboldt's barometric leveling from Cartagena to Santafé for his Nivelación de algunas plantas que cultivamos en las cercanías del Ecuador, leveling of some plants that we culture in the vicinity of the equator. However, the conceptual determinants of this work were, as we saw, explicitly defined by Caldas in his memoir on natural plants and tummutis on April 21, 1902, in which, meaning 1 year before, in which he commented that he was planning barometric botanical leveling similar to those Mr. Baron de Humboldt had built with the sole purpose of giving an idea of the various heights of the land. End of quote. Such was the plan of Caldas, synthesizing 5 years of analysis and phytogeographic work as inspired by the barometric profile that he had drawn in his trip from Cartagena to Bogotá with no botanical components whatsoever, of which Caldas had received at least one copy drawn in Santa Fe by his countryman Santiago Pérez de Arroyo. Caldas referred as follows to this copy sent by Arroyo in the right of your screens, dated August 6, 1801, while the Prussian was staying in that same city. I quote, "The profile of the barometric leveling that you have been kind enough to outline and refer to me has given me a great idea of the knowledge, the accuracy, and the extent of the Baron's plan. This profile is a treasure for me. It has everything one could wish for in its domain. It has consoled me by the almost no difference of my determinations as compared with those of the Baron, as well as in measure as in elevation of the barometer in Santa Fe and in Guadalupe, a small mountain in the outskirts of Bogotá." End of quote. In a following letter that same day, signed in Quito, Caldas commented to his cousin, Antonio Arboleda, this same profile as copied by Arroyo from Humboldt's sketch. I quote, "Arroyo writes me and tells me about the Baron. He tells me he was leaving on August 9 for Popayan. He includes a profile of a barometric leveling from Cartagena to Santa Fe with an expression of the latitudes, elevation of the land, nature of minerals, with other very, very curious things." End of quote. In the absence of a primary source that, with Humboldt's endorsement for this referral, some historians have contextualized them, these two referrals, in an environment of scientific espionage in New Granada. Caldas himself, in a letter to Antonio Arboleda in Popayan, revealed the existence of at least one more copy of Humboldt's profile. I quote, "Humboldt's observations are a real treasure for me. They follow those contained in the Nivellement Barometric that you sent me and I had already received from our Santiago Arroyo, the one you see in your screens." End of quote. The Baron's leveling on the left of your screens was then the first document available, as copied by Arroyo in the right, available to Caldas to calibrate his own measurements. And in this process, he applied his characteristic critical judgment that would eventually distance him from Humboldt in his cohabitation in the audience of Quito from December 31, 1801 to June 9, 1802. When Caldas reviewed Humboldt's barometric profile in detail, he found some inconsistencies that he reported to Santiago Arroyo 15 days later. Excuse me. I quote, "I have found in the profile or barometric leveling that the latitudes expressed at the foot are not in proportion. And you should observe these either by the cut by the meridian or by any other direction inclined to it. You can observe that from Cartagena to Mompós, there is a difference in latitude, 1 degree, 10 minutes, 39 seconds. And from Mompós to Angostura or Carare, 3 degrees, 1 minute, 18 seconds. Despite the difference expressed between Cartagena and Mompós, it seems almost triple of the one between Mompós and the Angostura. I observe the same deformity between this point and Onda, the valley of Villeta and Santafé. Please consider this objection and let us tell him something about this in Quito," end of quote. Beyond these astronomical inconsistencies, and seasoned with the highs and lows in the personal relationships of these two naturalists in Quito, I will suggest that Caldas freely adopted and recurrently used the Humboldtian term of leveling for the title of his original phytogeographical file signed on April 6, 1803. Likewise, Humboldt's iconographic epiphany would have been inspired by Caldas in their personal encounters through Caldas's criticism and writings explicitly read by the Prussian as he passed through Popayan, and most particularly by Caldas' letter dated November 17, 1802 in Otavalo to Lima, and sent to while he was still in Lima, before traveling to Guayaquil, where he reportedly draw the first draft of his tableau physique on the Chimborazo. This letter of Caldas contained a description of the phytogeographical activities that he was developing since their farewell in Quito, focusing on the Imbabura volcano. Conclusion. I will quote a sentence written by Humboldt in Mexico in April 29, 1803, in a letter to Carl Ludwig Wildenau, his mentor in botany in Berlin, in which he validates Caldas in a short list of outstanding naturalists met by him in his American expedition. I quote, "I will only mention you now as the most active men: Tafalla in Guayaquil, Olmedo in Loja, Matisse, the first plant painter in the world and a great botanist in Santa Fe, a pupil of Mutis, as well as some Capuchins in New Andalusia and Guyana, in Venezuela. Also a distinguished and eager naturalist, Mr. Caldas, from Popayan," end of quote. With this validation, I can wrap up this talk stating that in the course of subsequent interactions and counterpoints between Humboldt and Caldas, two iconographic landmarks, Chimborazo and Imbabura, emerged as emblematic references of early 19th century biogeography near the equator, with evident differences in their execution and their contents. I will close with Professor Stephen Jackson's impression on this same subject, as he was definitely right 11 years ago when he wrote, quote, "Caldas, like Forster, Wildenau, and Goethe, is an important figure in the development of Humboldt's ideas concerning plant geography, which were well developed by the time he met Caldas," end of quote. I'm happy to confirm that 3 days ago, in his opening lecture, Dr. Jackson once again implied the importance of what these two Neogranadian encounters of Alexander von Humboldt in the development of his geography of plants. Thank you very much.
Okay, Professor Gómez, thank you very much for joining us today and sharing all your knowledge on Humboldt's legacy with us. That's tremendous and very fascinating work. So I want to advertise a bit Professor Gómez's book series Humboldtiana Neogranadina. This is a work in 5 volumes, if I'm not wrong, compiled and edited by Professor Gómez. And these books, or this series of books, seeks to review in detail the contribution of Alexander von Humboldt in science and transnational cooperation in what refers to the current territory of Colombia. So, okay, thank you very much again, Professor Gómez, for your participation in this event. So,